Right, so like so many things, the idea of water as fuel is not a new idea. It actually first came out in 1874 with Jules Verne, who called water the coal of tomorrow. So water as fuel has been kicking around for ages. But it really came to prominence in the 1970s, like so many of these things, because of the petrol crisis. There was a fuel crisis. And because of that, people were really looking hard at loads of different ways of generating fuel to run stuff like their cars. And the water car, which ran only on water, became very popular then. But like everything, it has a history. Now, just to clarify a little bit about what a water car is not. I mean, the first thing, it's not water injection. So Luke, who is our resident petrol head, is doing a water injection video over on Welcome to the World of TNT, and I've put the link down in the bottom if you want to have a look at that. But water injection is about injecting water into the fuel as the fuel enters the carburetor or as the fuel enters the piston. But like I say, Luke does a really good job on that, and that is not what is meant by a water car. The other thing that isn't meant is a steam engine. A steam engine obviously takes water, boils the water, and it's the expansion of the water that creates the work, and that's using water as the working fluid, not as a fuel. And we're also not talking about the hydrogen car, because of course water splits into hydrogen and oxygen, although there is a partial hydrolysis producing something called HHO, which is Brown's gas. That gas is then burnt, and a water car is not meant by that. There's a bit of a crossover point, and we'll talk about that later, but that's a hydrogen car, and of course hydrogen cars are something that are being well researched. Now, interestingly enough, only about 4% of the hydrogen that's produced comes from electrolysis of water. The other 96% comes from the cracking of fuels, hydrocarbons. That's where we get most of our hydrogen from. Actually, it's the cracking of methane. So it's not moving away from fossil fuels, and that's because electrolysis of water actually isn't particularly good or particularly efficient, and so we only get 4% of it. So we're not talking about specifically hydrogen cars and hydrogen generation, where the hydrogen is external. The other thing is it's not a hydrogen fuel enhancement, because you can put hydrogen in the same way you do water injection. You can inject hydrogen and fuel into the car together, or HHO, and get an improvement in fuel economy and in runtime from the injection of hydrogen in the same way you can with the injection of water, actually. So we're not talking about any of those things when we're talking about a water car. A water car is a car that runs from water. Now, there have been a ton of efforts on this, and you find an awful lot of newspaper articles, an awful lot of television that's been done on it, and of course the internet abounds with various water fuel cars and claims that people have run from Land's End to John O'Groats or from Seattle to Tampa only on a litre of water. Now, perhaps the most widely reported one was the Garrett Electrolytic capacitor, which came out in 1935 and received an awful lot of attention from the, I think it was the Dallas Morning News. Anyway, it was in the newspapers. And there was a patent which showed a carburetor that was an electrolytic chamber, electrolyzed the water, used the hydrogen that came off and injected that in. It was back in the 80s when Stan was talking about his dune buggy and it would run on nothing but water. The problem was Stan gave conflicting ideas about how this thing worked. One was it was like a water splitter that took place of your spark plug, and it used resonance to split the water before it burnt. And then the other one was that there was an electrolyzer hidden in the tank, in the boot, and that provided hydrogen for this to work. The problem was, Stan gave lots of demonstrations, but would let nobody look at it. And of course, in 1996, the Ohio court found him guilty of gross fraud, and that is perhaps a black mark against you. And he dropped dead of an aneurysm in a car park in 1998, and that fueled conspiracy theory that he'd been poisoned and his death was most mysterious. But whatever you think about Stan Meyers, there's been a lot of attempts to replicate what it is that he's done. And of course, they haven't been that successful, let's be kind. They've been... So as you would expect, the 80s was rife with this kind of innovation, and we covered one in the chlorine car when we looked at running a car on chlorine. Of course, water came up, and it kind of died a death after the fuel crisis was over and everybody went back to their normal way of living, till sort of like the 2000s or so, when you see an awful lot more of hydrogen injection and water splitting cells. And I'm thinking here of things like the Joe cell, for instance. There was a chap called Dennis Klein. In 2002, he brought out something called the Aquagen. And the Aquagen was supposed to work in exactly that way. It took water and somehow it split the water. There was no external energy, and this was able to run a car. And Klein claimed that he was in negotiation with the US Department of Defense. However, a few years later, they stepped back from that entire thing, and now they promote the Aquagen as a HHO generator as a replacement for oxyacetylene. Also in 2002, Genesis World Energy came out with the device. They actually put it into practice in 2003, where they claimed it would run only from water splitting and be able to run a car. They took, I think it was about $2.5 million in investment, and in 2006, the guy who led the company, which was Patrick Kelly, and I'm not 100% sure, but I think it's the same Patrick Kelly who did Free Energy Devices, that book that circulates around on the internet as a PDF of all the up-to-date free energy devices. Anyway, he was found guilty of fraud in 2006 and spent 5 years in prison because of that. In 2008, a Japanese company called Genepax came out with a water-fueled car that they claimed ran on a mysterious electrolyte membrane device which used metal hydride, created a HHO gas which was burnt in the cylinder. They never really revealed details, but went bankrupt in 2009, saying that the costs of development of the engine were too great, and they just closed their doors. Also in 2008, there was a Sri Lankan chap, Thushara Priyamal, and he came out with a water-splitting engine where he claimed that he was able to drive across the length and breadth of Sri Lanka on only 3 litres of water, and he got government interest. But it all came to nothing when he was arrested for fraud and investment scamming. And there's another guy called Daniel Dingle, who since, I think it's 1969, is a Filipino, and was talking about a water-splitting car that he'd invented. And he managed to convince an investor to invest a large sum of money with him to further develop this device, because, of course, who wouldn't be interested in that? Unfortunately, of course, he suffered the same fate as a lot of people, that he was basically attempting to run a scam, and he was doing it in the Philippines. It's not the greatest place to do it, where they'll imprison you if you have a teddy bear full of cocaine, even if you don't know it's full of cocaine. And he was imprisoned for 20 years for running that scam. One important one I want to mention actually is Agar Waha Ahmed. He was a Pakistani who in 2012 reckoned that he was running a water car using a water kit. The reason I mention this water kit is because the water kits became super important across the internet. Everybody was selling these kits and creating electrolyzer bubblers that you could actually add to your car that was supposed to improve the fuel economy 300% or so. They didn't, and they sort of died a death, but there was a period of time there, if you looked on the internet on Watercar, you saw nothing but these bubbler kits, and that guy was actually particularly famous for having kicked that off and getting a lot of advertising based on that. If we leave aside throughout the history of the development of these devices, they have really been littered with, well, fraud and pseudoscience. I think the most disappointing thing about them is they are in fact not water for fuel. They're actually electrolyzers. Most of them develop hydrogen or HHO gas from electrolysis of the water or separation of the water by some means, and then they burn that resulting gas. And I think that's because of the way we think about fuel. Fuel is something we burn, and of course you can't burn water, so you have to make it into something you can burn and get water back. But they are hydrogen engines in disguise. They are masquerading as being water when they are in fact hydrogen. And I personally find that quite disappointing, because although you can't burn water, you can explode water. Now this is based on the work of Peter and Neil Granow in the 1990s. And it was work published in the Journal of Plasma Physics in 1998, where it applied a high voltage arc across a whole series of experiments and basically shot projectiles into the sky. Now, I did something on this many years ago when I shot tomatoes in the sky. It's based on a cavitation phenomenon. You explode the water and it rushes back in itself and creates a cavitation bubble in pretty much the same way that a boat propeller does, and very similar to what the pistol shrimp does. This cavitation that's either formed mechanically or by application of a high voltage arc can generate power. That, to my mind, would be using water as fuel, because it's the water that you're actually acting on using high voltage or mechanical means, and then that could actually be a fuel. So if people were to explore that, I might be a bit more convinced that we were using the water as a fuel as opposed to converting the water into something else. So if I was asked, why haven't we got a water fuel car? Well, I would answer, not because of terrible government conspiracies or buyouts by petrol companies, but quite simply because nobody's been working on one. They've all been working on hydrogen and HHO burners, because in our minds the idea is that a fuel must burn. And I suspect if we took a bit of a deeper look at Granau and we looked at these anomalous events that happen with high voltage and cavitation in water, we'd move an awful lot more close to a genuine water for fuel car. Anyway, I thought I would share that little potted history and my thoughts with you. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching, and please remember to like and subscribe.